we were a couple months ago on all of this stuff. So it's all good in the hood.
Perfect.
See, we even have a little customized chyron now in the front of the show, so that you can find yourself
from an undisclosed location.
Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our professionals have acquired years of experience, which ensures you get the very best. Our experienced staff is waiting to hear from you and to answer any specific questions that you may have on how we can meet your needs. Just ask for a consultation and let us prove our commitment to you as we promise to maintain the highest level of quality and commitment. Your satisfaction is our prime concern. So please, don't hesitate to get in contact with us and let us show you all the great options we have.
And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at coalition_radio, and of course the mothership now at coalitionradionetwork.com. You can see a lot of our digital, analog, older shows at coalitionradio.us as well. And a special request this week, if you watch this live on the YouTube or Periscope, take a moment if you would, and if you could subscribe to our YouTube page, we'd be grateful. So, we're getting back, in a sense, to our network's basics. We've had a lot of fun over the last few weeks. We've got some new shows on the network which feature a couple of different groups who are active at the most fundamental level in addressing racial justice issues here in Rhode Island. They've proven to be outstanding efforts. You can see them on Tuesday and Thursday nights at 7:30. We've got a new golf show that's premiered, and they actually broadcast live just last week from Kirkbrake Golf Club in Lincoln, Rhode Island, and they'll be doing a lot of live remotes. But the heart and soul of this effort has and always will be political. And when we talk about political, of course, we're talking to a certain degree social justice issues. We're talking about economic justice. We're talking about real politic. Getting past the outrage porn that seems to dominate the airwaves, even at a time when we're suffering through an international pandemic, centuries-old relationships being decimated by the politics of COVID, as well as the politics of economics, as well as the politics of social justice, as well as the politics of racial justice. There has never been a time, I believe, in American history where honest conversation between subject matter experts is more important. We have become a nation of science deniers. We have become a nation of historical deniers. We all exist seemingly in our own private Idaho. It's time for that to end. And we're going to start again tonight with someone who is no stranger to the show. He is firmly ensconced in what we call repeat offender status. And of course, I'm talking about Professor Andrew Hernandez. He is of the Western New Mexico University, PhD. He has covered, both on the classroom level and on the very ground floor in the field, issues surrounding all of what we've spoken about, including, but not limited to, areas like the drug war, border trade issues. And now, in past months, seemingly at the end of our interviews, we've always grown a little bit maudlin, and we say, is this in fact the culmination of all of those issues intersection? Professor, I got to believe we finally reached, level 10. Or in the great movie Spinal Tap, we've turned it up to 11. How have you been, and how is Deming, New Mexico?
I've been pretty well. I think, keep in mind that I've been reasonably isolated from the outside world because there's just isn't that much that I've been required to do outside of my house. So, I go out when necessary and cautiously. I regret to say that my town and New Mexico, there's a steady uptick in the number of cases here. We're certainly not the 4-alarm fire that you see in Arizona or Texas right now, but sandwiched in between both of them with the fact that so many people in rural New Mexico like to spend their weekends in those areas, and the Texans like to come out to our national wilderness and lake and that sort of thing, and true their consequences, that we're going to be heading upwards for the conceivable future, I think.
It's darkly ironic. Rhode Island was really one of the first two states hit by it, by a combination of culture, geography, a people taking real control and seemingly taking very seriously the masking and the social contact rules. And I know people are inflamed by that, particularly folks who are right of center. But ultimately, we're one of two states where the rate is actually declining. It's I think it's partially geography, and but that again, we had 10,000+ people march in close formation at the Black Lives Matter march. I was one of them. Everybody was masked, and people were careful, even though they were in close proximity, of physical contact. We seem to be the place it's worked so far. Of course, now we're going into tourism season, and we'll see how that goes. Cities like Newport draw an international crowd even when things are largely shut down, and we see a lot of that chaos. But clearly, this is an issue that's redefining our international trade policy, our relationships with organizations. I believe it was this morning, late last night, it became public that our president, Donald Trump, had decided to withdraw us from the World Health Organization. I know that's not really on our normal topic list, but as someone who has, immersed himself in the interrelationships, not just at the purely political level, but at the governmental level, how does that bode for the United States and the international communities?
I think it's one step towards the United States seeming to move hell-bent towards the direction of becoming a pariah state. We seem to have rushed headlong into a series of policies where Americans are not welcome in other countries. Of course, Europe has gotten a lot of attention in the last week with EU nations restricting access to Americans being able to travel there, but this is actually true in other countries as well. Mexico has largely shut off the overwhelming majority of access that American citizens had to that country as well. So we seem to be very quickly isolating ourselves in every meaningful way. And for as much as there's an ongoing conversation about competition versus cooperation, pandemics really seem to be the place where you want to value cooperation above all else. And we just seem to not be doing that right now.
From your perspective, the Trump administration is citing claims that, and here's where the term dog whistle comes into effect. The dog whistle that's coming through is somehow that a group of people in Wuhan got together with the World Health Organization and conspired to create a virus the likes of which the world hasn't seen, regardless of some people's analogies comparing it to the common flu. We'll just let that hang out there. What type of mind, what's happened to our culture that 10 years ago, that would have been you would have been laughed out of the room if you come out with something like that. What's happened to our culture from your perspective that now is the coin of the realm?
To be honest, I think that it's more that we're aware of it than we used to be. I've looked back over pretty extensively over various Cold War era records. There are so many historians who have as well. If you look back to some of the major anti-communist conspiracy theories that gained currency in the United States from the end of World War II all the way to really not that long ago, you see a lot of crazy stuff out there. It's just that it was limited to conventions, it was limited to word of mouth, it was limited to mass mailing and that sort of thing. It wasn't the type of thing that you would necessarily see on the evening news. There certainly wasn't anything as pervasive as social media to spread the word.
So that's how, in other words, assaulting and burning down 5G towers and claiming that the world is flat is a little bit of craziness that is just being shared like a Facebook page now. Is that wow, you're probably right, but holy cow, that's I
have actually for a long time I've only kept up with Facebook to keep up with family, to find out what my cousins and nieces and nephews are doing with their lives and to be proud of them. And my Facebook very precariously leaned towards becoming a game of whack-a-mole because people started basically sharing faked and corrupted versions of history amongst their pages. And the first couple of times I pointed people to better readings and sources and that they were wrong. And nobody ever really appreciates being told that they're flat out wrong. So that didn't get very far. And it took a lot more energy than I wanted to spend anyway, and almost no result.
That seems to be the common observation. And incredibly enough, there are a host of new social media companies that have popped up to cater to folks who feel like somehow that they've been disenfranchised and rendered neutered because of the restrictions of Facebook, which, given the lunacy I see on Facebook, I someone who is kind of edgy himself, my politics aren't exactly, central or center, left or right. They're an extreme. The notion that exists is scary in and of itself. So let's get down to it. I mean, we focus a lot on the border, and I always want to stress, and I'll do a quick retelling of how we met because it's been a little while since you've been on. The professor and I had the opportunity. We were sort of an arranged date, if you will, between a Methodist minister who caters to a flock that's pretty eclectic and under a great deal of stress financially, economically, geopolitically, and does an amazing job of it. I've listened to some of his sermons now. He's a wonderful person, and I happened to pop in on him one afternoon on the day of their annual barbecue social, and still remains one of the great barbecue experiences of my life. I still tremble at the thought, but so he thought it'd be fun that we would meet, and I guess fun is one word. We like sort of on our first date at a Denny's, we spent all night talking politics, literally. And then I got up and drove over to Mexico to interview people who were trying to get back over the border with us. It was a hectic weekend, but since then we've had conversations that's focused a lot on a real dichotomy. In one sense, to the people of southern Arizona, southern New Mexico, southwestern Texas, the normalcy with which the border is an everyday part of their lives, but simultaneously these incredible issues and these incredible pressures that are coming down upon them and tearing at the fabric of what largely had been a cohesive social structure that really incorporated communities on both sides of the border, to the point where folks who are residents of Mexico attend grammar school. The children attend school over here in the United States, and they don't have to sneak anywhere to do it. It's an established relationship that has broadened people's educational perspectives for years now, and it's worked, and it continues to work. So against that backdrop, now we see the continuing stress of folks who are refugees, and now, of course, the Trump administration, seemingly incapable of irony, because ultimately we are the problem with COVID. Most of the developed world has found ways to deal with it. But how is he intending to impact, if you will, legal refugee status with regard to the illness?
Essentially, by executive order, legal asylum seeking is over in terms of crossing the border by ground. I haven't heard as much about people who are able to fly into the country, but that has its own restrictions at this point. But by and large, there have been a series of nearly 24 executive orders or executive actions since March that have effectively dragged migration over the border to a halt. People are no longer being detained and processed. They're simply being escorted immediately back to a border crossing after they're fingerprinted. There was a heartbreaking case that was reported in the El Paso Times today. I kind of keep a running tally, of course, for my own research, but it also helps for this, of things to talk about, things to share with my classes, things to be able to use in general to be a good citizen as well as a good teacher. And so despite all of that, I was inundated with 4 bits of breaking news just before we went on the air. So there was a woman named Angeline who is a Honduran asylum seeker who managed to cross into across the international border in the vicinity of El Paso. She's 8 months pregnant. She left San Pedro Sula in Honduras, which is one of the deadliest cities in the world. Her partner was murdered right in front of her. Everything that she had was stolen by one of the local gangs. She fled for her life with a very clear belief that she would be murdered if she returned to her home city. And within hours of being caught entering the United States, she was escorted back to the international crossing and released into Mexico. I don't think I'm going to hear my pro-life associates harping on that, even though you would think that would be the sort of thing that would get their attention.
Because, and I'm going to ask you to explain it because you'll do a much more thorough and professional job than I will. Folks leaving countries like that are exactly for whom the legal refugee program was created under American federal law, wasn't it?
Of course. Well, and keep in mind, too, though, that we're the signatory for various treaties that have gone into that have been articulated in U.S. law as well. And so we're acting in contravention of all of these, primarily through executive order, with probably the most damning thing being that even though all of this is justified as part of public health policy, area sector chiefs and supervisors have the authority to assess on the spot whether or not a person is in danger and to make exceptions to standing orders. And I have not, while I'm aware of that, the ability to grant exceptions, I'm not aware of any exceptions, and I haven't really heard anybody talking about them either. And the Border Patrol and ICE, of course, are very articulate in using press releases to put themselves in the best light possible. It's quite damning that they're not talking about these things either.
Now, if you could reflect a moment, you know, you and I have an ongoing conversation, and folks who are intimately aware of the border relationships and what's happening in a variety of countries do. But you spoke about a city in Honduras being possibly one of the most dangerous cities on earth. And, you know, with that, a lot of folks will just, you'll get the blank stare. You know, they associate cities like Fallujah. They associate certain, if you're old enough, Eastern Bloc cities or cities in Southeast and Southwest Asia as being dangerous. They might not associate cities in countries that are in Central or Latin America. So why specifically is that one particular part of the Honduras so dangerous?
It is primarily due to drug trafficking tied to cartel and gang activity. There are various trafficking organizations that essentially have nearly uncontested control in those areas. And it's not just Honduras, it's in parts of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua as well.
So by
and it transcends
it
transcends national boundaries. There was just a piece in the Washington Post earlier this week that Guatemalan drug traffickers have created effectively their own air bases in southern Mexico.
Wow. And of course, for fans of the show, this is a rhetorical question. For whom are they producing said narcotics?
Primarily for us, of course. I don't want to paint just us in a bad light because essentially we're talking about people with money here. And so Europe and China have begun to give us a run for our money on drug demand. But when we're talking about the area from Central America to Mexico to the United States, we're primarily talking about a market heading towards Americans.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And so the primary intention, and I'm being, as we say, Captain Obvious here, the primary intention of the refugee program as it is codified under American law is to create opportunities for people who are facing exigent harm and or death due to a variety of circumstances, lawlessness being one of them, and the notion that a return to that society would, in fact, result in imminent death. We have the specter of an American president who is based on a fairly tenuous connection between a terrible disease, but based on that, using, in your mind, is he using it just as a prop to force this? Or is there a legitimate concern? Okay.
Well, so we take a look at consistency, okay? You know, the administration shows no other sign of taking the transmission of disease seriously. In national orders to wear masks and national orders to socially distant and national orders to restrict travel between hotspots and areas that are not quite as glaring in the infection rate as it is right now. It's only in the area of the handful of people who are actually able to cross into the United States that the administration is using any sort of language of public health.
It's striking, isn't it? I mean, it really is the only place. They're not even faking it anywhere else, are they?
No, they are not. And so, just for example, I mean, for as much as I have restricted my own activity outside, there are things that I do go do. I weigh the risk. I wear a mask. I stay socially distant. But, since May, I've traveled probably 4 different times across 2 different Border Patrol checkpoints within the United States. And there was only one occasion where the agent who was asking about my citizenship status was actually wearing a mask. I can't begin to imagine on a daily basis the exposure that any given agent is subjecting themselves to in being within 2 feet of an automobile and asking a person questions. And yet, overwhelmingly, even though various agencies in Homeland Security have also protested that they don't have enough PPE, you just don't, in some of those very public settings, you don't see agents taking their own safety seriously.
Right. I mean, the fundamental stuff, I'm out there in the world. Common sense sometimes eludes me as well, but I marched in that 10,000 plus person parade. Fascinatingly enough, it was the young people who chastised me if I took a break and, put my mask down, in order to breathe a little easier. You're talking about folks who, and this is what's stunning to me, and the Border Patrol, and I'm talking about going both ways. You're dealing with public health crises all the time. You're talking about people going back and forth between incredibly impoverished areas for whom some of the fundamentals are a challenge. And that's not by any means an attempt to insult those folks. It's just the harsh reality with which they're dealt. And it can be stunning. When you get away from the tourist areas, the differential in economics is stunning. It's life-changing when you actually see it in the flesh, as I have.
It can be, but even so, we're going on a century worth of the characterization of Mexicans as dirty and carriers of disease, and having that generalized towards migrants of all stripes. And the simple fact is the disease is not entering the United States across the international boundary. Right. It's leaving the United States and entering other countries.
And that's the irony here, because ultimately, if there, and I'll use a phrase from another century, if there was a typhoid Mary here, it would actually be the United States. We're the problem. It's around the world, folks, through a variety of measures, some of them authoritarian, some of them not, are finding ways to put some measure of control on this. And we just lurch from crises to crises with it. So are we becoming an exporter of this disease? I don't know.
We absolutely are. You can see that in how Mexico and Canada are steeply restricting American access to their countries. We can see it in the international boundary between California and Mexico, where just a week and a half ago, there was a 7-hour wait because Mexican public health officials finally started questioning each American vehicle crossing into the country, where they were intending to go, checking temperatures and that sort of thing. And this was just before travel was restricted even further. You have something similar in Arizona. Remarkably, this is not just an American problem, because China showed a remarkable authoritarian capacity to cut off the transmission of COVID earlier in the year. Russia certainly has an authoritarian government, and they are just short of helpless right now in stopping transmission there. Brazil, I wouldn't characterize as authoritarian, but they certainly didn't need our help to let COVID get out of control in their country.
Mm. Interesting. Now, what impact has this had, from your perspective, on two different but prescient issues, trade and the wall?
It's remarkable how much trade continues to go on. We just haven't seen the sort of price increases that would tell us that everything from iPhones to fruit are not making it into the United States. That comes with a cost, though, because maquilas in northern Mexico have horrific infection rates right now.
I mean, you are working
in
close proximity. I mean, this is fundamental manufacturing at hyper speed in close proximity. That, wherever that happens, we saw that in food processing plants in the United States, didn't we?
We also see it in farms. The infections and suspected infection rates there are very high across the United States, and people are still showing up to work and picking berries and processing chicken and pork and that sort of thing. There has not been an ongoing appreciable shortage of those things in the United States and in other countries yet.
Well, there's our style of shortages and true shortages. You get a couple empty aisles at Costco, and there's a collective nervous breakdown in the United States. We are not well equipped to deal with that. What about the wall? We're entering the end game now in a 4-year marathon. The ultimate reality game, surviving Donald Trump. There's been fits and starts, and now I'm reading through your help and through others reports that wall construction, in fact, has been challenged because of on-site disease. Where does that stand?
So there was a success in southern New Mexico in the Columbus area, which of course you have been to and seen yourself. There was a contractor there bringing large numbers of workers in to improve and expand the walling there. That was brought to a halt, largely due to policies in New Mexico. The fundamental thing about the wall, though, that we all have to keep in mind is that anytime you see the wall covered in the news, it's important to distinguish between old barriers of different types that are being replaced versus actual new barriers that are going up. And despite $15 billion of expenditures in this fiscal year so far, there are actually only 3 new miles of barrier in the United States. The rest of them have been replacement of old structures.
So the wall, for all intents and purposes, might be the single biggest failed campaign promise in American history? Or am I just being silly?
Well, you have to start with the relatively low bar that the Trump administration was aiming for, because they wanted to have 450 miles of new barrier in place by the end of 2020. Mm-hmm. By December 2019, Homeland Security reported that only 90 miles of barrier had gone up, and 93 miles, and 91 miles of that was replacing existing structure. Mm-hmm. It's gotten to the point, basically, the folks who take a lot of time looking at border security and thinking of ways that the United States can effectively really start to interdict some of the serious criminal activity that's able to cross in relatively open areas, is to have a series of high technology virtual walls, mobile surveillance towers, drones, and that sort of thing. And just in time for the July 4th weekend, the Trump administration fairly publicly admitted that they saw a virtual wall as being something that they would finally support with significant resources.
Now, you talked about New Mexico policies impacting wall construction. Develop that a little bit for me, if you will.
New Mexico has our governor's administration in Santa Fe has been fairly restrictive about the types of activities that have been ongoing since the pandemic began. It's part of the reason I suspect that our numbers are not nearly as bad as those. I shouldn't say I suspect. It's outright the reason our numbers aren't nearly as bad as those in surrounding states. But it does mean that there's a restriction on infrastructure projects. This was one that was deemed unnecessary, and by public health order, that construction company wasn't allowed to continue for the time being. You don't have that environment in Arizona. The primary construction that's gone on since March for any sort of barrier has been in southern Arizona, of course, where you have an administration much friendlier towards the Trump administration. And that's also where we're seeing major outbreaks in detention centers, among the personnel operating those centers, and also even in construction crews that are operating along the international boundary, to the point that Residents of towns like Ajo, Bisbee have been screaming since March that contractors who are working for these various construction firms aren't taking basic things like masks and distancing seriously, and they are spreading COVID in their communities.
Sort of like invading warriors, if you will, spreading death right before them. Do you believe that the states, particularly New Mexico, are going to be able to maintain this sort of impasse until there's either a cure or at least a vaccine or some level of remediation?
Well, I think part of the problem is that you're hitting on is that there's a moving target in terms of what the actual public health policy is, because vaccines just aren't things that you come up with quickly. There are certainly other nations in the Americas and across the world that are testing vaccines as well. The simple fact is that when we all went into seclusion in March and April, the idea was that that was an interim policy that would be replaced with national policies to help mitigate the spread, except we have not seen any national policies.
Right. And the disease itself continues to bedevil. This has got to be the single greatest pharmaceutical arms race in possibly world history. Because of just the sheer size of the technology and the bureaucracies, say relative to a time when, and I'm old enough to remember as a young child when polio was actively rampaging across the country. I knew people, I still know people who walk with a limp or who were infected seriously by polio. These generations successively have seen, at least on theory, the eradication of diseases like this, and quite frankly, don't have a perspective on, until now, what can actually happen to society, what it's like to live in fear. It's continues to puzzle us. Do you see, we always talk about grass shoots, green shoots, if you will. Do you see positives out of this at all, or are we just in a gigantic holding pattern right now?
I haven't really seen anything positive coming out of it. I've seen too much uncertainty. Just looking at my students, for example, students were wondering if they were coming back for fall, if they were going to be online, if there was going to be some sort of hybrid format. My institution, a lot of the institutions in the region have elected for a hybrid format. And of course, ICE hit the universities that have chosen online learning as their exclusive mode in the fall by saying that international students cannot get an exemption to study online, wholly online.
Which is, again, incredible. Perhaps you could take a moment, we'll divert for a second here. Can you explain to folks the incredible importance with which international students hold at literally every level of academia? Is there a way to encapsulate that and make people aware of that and understand that this isn't just some problem? How pervasive throughout the entire system are young men and women from around the world?
Extremely. It was either the Washington Post or the New York Times that posted a nice map of the degree to which international students were concentrated across the country. The simple fact is that despite being far outnumbered in terms of population, the United States has been able to maintain a lead in innovation, in patents, and intellectual property, and that sort of thing. And part of that is due to some of our own citizens to some degree, but it's also due to the fact that education is something that we actually export. People come to the United States to learn in our university system. And when they stay, it's a gain for all of us. And to punctuate the degree to which this used to be common sense, candidate Trump in 2015 said that if students want to come to the United States to learn and to stay, they should be able to do so.
And there are clearly great universities around the world, even just in the hemisphere, that are not American, that will only be too happy to accept those that we reject. You think about schools like McGill in Canada, which are, near high Ivy League level. Interestingly enough, by the way, today the Ivy League, in a groundbreaking announcement, has decided that football will be pushed off until the spring. So now all of a sudden we've got a whole group of people paying attention, because if it affects football, damn it, it's got to be serious. Wow. You shared with us a story that I think has got layers of ramifications. We're in the United States here, we're in a mode now where we're questioning how the police pursue alleged criminals, how they interact with people in the community, as well as alleged criminals in the community. We've seen a great deal of tragedy about that in the last few months, and we're actually seeing for the first time some successful legal, if you will, results from police officers being prosecuted as opposed to hiding behind the euphemistically titled thin blue line. Talk to us about what happened with Border Patrol, and again, reflect maybe a little bit on the unique role that Border Patrol plays in the lives of folks around the southern rim, and to a certain degree in the north as well, but largely around the southern rim of the United States, and how they conduct themselves.
You do have a pervasive presence of Border Patrol and ICE, simply because there is the statutorily designated 100-mile zone of operations for the Border Patrol and for ICE that Homeland Security has actually pretty callously disregarded in the last few months. Mm-hmm. However, in terms of day-to-day operations, one of the biggest ones that just came up recently, there are many law enforcement agencies that have discontinued high-speed chases because of simply how bad the accidents can be, the potential for loss of life, loss of property, damage to the community, and that sort of thing. In late June, there was an accident in downtown El Paso where a vehicle had been challenged by the Border Patrol, where the vehicle had sped up and attempted to escape. There was a crash in downtown El Paso, killing 7 of the people in the vehicle. The Border Patrol issued a press release where they said that there had not been a high-speed chase, that agents had actually reduced speed, turned off their sirens. That actually got quite a bit of coverage in several outlets until eyewitnesses came forward and had some very good reporting from Alfred Corchado of the Dallas Morning News, who they were basically able to document that there was a high-speed chase, that sirens were running, that this vehicle was being chased at high speeds when it crashed, that most of the agents who were involved were immediately rendering aid, though there was at least one who was trying to ask people who were within inches of their lives what their citizenship was. And this is not an El Paso problem. There was a similar crash in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas in the last few weeks as well.
Now, even before the exacerbated racial tensions of the last 5 years, police departments around the country had been studying the impact of high-speed chases, when to engage, when to disengage. A lot of thought and a lot of deep thought was given to the conflict, central conflict there. How dangerous the potential escapee was versus the responsibility of police to behave in the community in a safe, lawful manner, and not to create tragedies where, quite frankly, none were needed. Is that same conversation never taken place in ICE? I mean, or is it just given lip service? Or what is the formal pronunciation, if you will, of the authorities who run ICE with respect to policy and procedure on high-speed car chases?
Well, in this particular case for the Border Patrol, I suspect they knew that this was the sort of thing that they shouldn't be doing. According to policy, they're supposed to avoid high-speed chases to every degree possible, and they took care to emphasize in their initial release that agents had not been engaged in a high-speed chase. I think it's probably only a matter of time. A lot of banks, hotels, baseball stadium, all sorts of businesses downtown El Paso. There's going to be camera footage in the near future too. And so these were folks who were aware that this is the sort of thing that that doesn't fall within any conception of best practice. And keep in mind here too, the term illegal is thrown around all the time for people who are in the United States without papers. 7 people died for possibly having been guilty of a misdemeanor violation. It is a misdemeanor to be in the United States without proper documentation. It is a misdemeanor in part by cold calculation, because if it were a felony, every person in a detention center would legally be entitled to the services of an attorney in pleading their cases.
Interesting.
By making most of these crimes misdemeanors, It comes down to pro bono work, the work of a few agencies who take on clients who cannot pay for their services and who are fighting the good fight in that respect.
Right.
So we're talking about people dying in a high-speed car chase for likely having committed at most a misdemeanor.
And given the federal status of said law enforcement community, I would imagine, hazarding to guess that few or little recriminations will be in place for these individuals. Are you optimistic at all that this will be successfully investigated and prosecuted if necessary?
No, I would find that supremely unlikely.
So, what you've got, and again, living in Rhode Island in New England, this is not something we think about because, quite frankly, even the part of New England that are in close proximity to the Canadian border, we're not exactly talking about a hornet's nest of criminal activity. It's probably there to agree, but it's nothing like the complexities that are happening in the southern border, if only because of the presence of the narco-terrorist element down in central Latin America. That I would imagine is a big variant between us and what's going on in Montreal. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I have to caution you there, Pat, because Homeland Security with ICE and Border Patrol has a 100-mile zone across the international boundaries for which they are legally able to operate. And yet, in the depth of the Black Lives Matters protests in Minneapolis, Homeland Security retasked a Predator drone to provide reconnaissance for law enforcement agencies in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. Minneapolis does not fall within 100 miles of the international boundary. It's nearly 400 miles away from Canada. So I haven't checked my atlas for how far away Providence is from Canada, but if you had protests where law enforcement asked for some help with surveillance, they might have been getting some help from Border Patrol, ICE, and Homeland Security with surveillance to start with. And this should trouble everybody, right? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when all of my conservative associates talked about overreach by law enforcement agencies. That's a clear-cut case of such overreach. And it's also a clear-cut case of militarization. A Predator drone is a military piece of equipment.
The most troubling part, and that's a fabulous point, one that I hadn't considered at all, that you've got folks who are right of center and who, as I like to say, drape themselves in the conversation. Drape themselves in the flag and the Constitution, who are oblivious to and supportive of the use of federal troops in responding to these type of protests, despite the fact that there is, acres of federal law and in fact support amongst the highest level of the military to not, if you will, commingle the armed forces into civil affairs. In a moment of, and possibly one of the most bizarre moments of the Trump administration, an administration filled with bizarre moments, you had the spectacle of the highest military leaders in the country pointing out how inappropriate it was for them to engage in these issues at any level. To me, it was a stunning moment, and you've just made it even more disturbing. Thank you for that.
Well, I will ante up one more time just to make it a bit more disturbing. I need to go track it back down again, but there was one particular press conference in which a representative of Homeland Security reminded everybody that in all likelihood, the Predator drone was not armed when it was retasked to provide reconnaissance over Minneapolis.
That's a relief.
Right.
Was that coincidence or forethought? But one of the issues surrounding the failure of American educational system to teach civics is a lack of understanding between the National Guard and our federal forces. In fact, there is a movement which we started to cover before things blew up with racial strife a few weeks ago, called Defend the Guard, which we had the lieutenant governor from the great state of Idaho on, talk about the need to dial back the guard. And that movement surrounds reinforcing constitutional protections at the state level, giving and reinforcing the governor's authority to withhold National Guard troops from foreign service. The implication, of course, being that we are going to respect those boundaries at some level. Yet, in the absence of a civics education, how often do you find, as an academic who believes in truth and is not a denier, folks don't understand those distinctions?
Most don't. Before 9/11, I was very sad on behalf of the people who served in the National Guard, who didn't pay attention to the fact that they could be called up to serve in the war on terror, and they were. The legislation enabling that goes back to the border conflicts of 1915, 1916. But the important piece of context there is that when the United States was hurriedly trying to deploy troops to the border, we did not have a large standing army in 1915.
Right.
The National Guard, essentially still called the militia in many states, that was basically the emergency call up that you could do to bring together some people that theoretically had military training, even though that really wasn't usually the case. But that was the stopgap for the fact that you did not have a large standing military. Mm-hmm. After 1945, there is no point in U.S. history to the present where you can describe us as not having a significant standing military. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
which makes it all the more important to restore National Guard control, put it much more effectively concentrated in the hands of the governors.
We've got time for one final area, and this to me is astonishing. You referred to an article in USA Today when you talk about the dichotomy in terms of treatment of not only folks who are under the control of immigration courts, but you're also talking about the staff, the attorneys, the judges. The Trump administration has essentially kept the immigration legal system, for lack of a better term, in a pre-COVID environment, haven't they?
So there are a couple of tiers here. The two that are most important is that detention centers have their own infrastructure for conducting hearings. Mm-hmm. Now, the cynical piece at play here is that frequently the judges who are administration appointees are appearing virtually, mm-hmm. Whereas the attorneys who need to represent people who are having their cases heard need to be there in person. Right. The piece that I sent you from USA Today is dealing primarily with the immigration courts that are operating outside of detention centers.
Okay.
And so, in my own life, I see, for example, judges and attorneys who in New Mexico within the state system who have argued passionately and emphatically over setting standards for when you can have face-to-face trials and when you cannot. Nationally, there's no such series of coherent policies being put in place. And so you do have immigration courts operating outside of detention centers in many states that are operating without any regard for the creation of a coherent policy to provide for the safety of everybody who's involved.
Right. The same conditions, by the way, largely exist within the network of often private prisons that are being used by ICE for as holding pens, for lack of a better term, around the country. I'm going to send you this interview that we had. Next time we talk, I'd love for you to comment on it. We're fortunate here in Rhode Island to have the Roger Williams University School of Law have created an immigration clinic, and it's run by a wonderful attorney named Deborah Gonzalez. Out here, we've got a for-profit prison. To me, it's a perfect example of what I call economic racism. Years ago, about 15, 20 years ago, a very poor town in Rhode Island called Central Falls was coerced and cajoled and sort of bribed, if you will, that if they built this detention center, the Wyatt Detention Center, that it would bring jobs to Central Falls and bring money and income and prestige. Well, I think you know how the movie really ended. You've got a facility here that is horrific in terms of its treatment of prisoners during the COVID era. And, we were fortunate to have the immigration clinic in conjunction with the American Civil Liberties Union set up a case and pursued it that got folks who were in trial, by the way, for difficult issues. I mean, but they got them removed and actually got them put on the almost everywhere present ankle bracelet. But at least these folks, after several weeks, were removed from a facility that didn't even observe basic hygiene, never mind hygiene in the age of COVID. Is that a surprise to you that exists throughout the entire ICE network?
It is not. And essentially, you can look at how states are aggregating their statistics. You can point pretty clearly at the type of detention centers that you're describing are operating by the statistics that each state is releasing. New Mexico, just as a for instance, we aggregate out. New Mexico's Department of Health publishes the statistics based on county, except for the major detention centers, whether they're state-run or privately run, whether they're dealing with immigration detainees and that sort of thing. The highest numbers are invariably in the prison system.
Mm-hmm. With no accountability.
No, and in fact, with every possible incentive to shade numbering. When you look, for example, at Homeland Security statistics for the number of its personnel who are infected, they do not include contractors at these type of detention centers. They only include the people who are formally designated as employees of one of the agencies of Homeland Security.
To your earlier point about misdemeanors essentially leaving an entire segment of society attorneyless without basic legal representation, I have to remark to you, and if you listen to this interview, I'd actually love to arrange a conversation between the two of you because it'd be fascinating. This attorney, in conjunction with 3 other attorneys at this clinic who all teach law full-time and are all quite busy with conventional, I will say, immigration issues, took hundreds of man-hours to put this case, what at least on a superficial level, to someone who is ignorant like myself of the true creation of a defense case or a prosecution case, hundreds of hours involved in putting together the fundamental documentation, the witnesses necessary, so that 3 middle-aged men who were literally at times connected by handcuffs to other individuals, not exactly social distancing, without any sort of PPE, as we've begun to call it, in operating in bathrooms that were cleaned weekly at best. What it took to get them out of that facility was Herculean. Extrapolate that over tens of thousands of individuals at border facilities and at cities like Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island, in this case a small city called Central Falls, and you see the enormity of the task and just what hell can be created by an administration who decides that they're effectively going to turn a weaponized federal justice system on a group of people. It's horrifying to watch, even here in Rhode Island, at its its lowest levels. I can't imagine what it's like to have this as part of your daily life in areas far closer to the border, regardless of where they are in the United States.
But, interestingly, we're talking about legal agencies across the country, though, because I'm very proud of the fact that I have colleagues across the country who volunteer for law firms and for attorneys, because part of these hundreds of hours of labor that go into making a case for somebody who's seeking asylum is that a judge will want to hear about the conditions in the country they fled from. Mm-hmm. So people who have expertise in these countries are stepping forward and volunteering their time left and right to say that if a person is fleeing Leon, Nicaragua, these are the conditions that they're fleeing. This is the rate of impunity in prosecution. This is the degree to which drug trafficking is an issue. And multiply that times all of these cases.
Yeah, we're very fortunate here in Rhode Island that we've got a very, very strong tradition of lawyers working effectively pro bono for the American Civil Liberties Union. We are truly blessed here in Rhode Island that there's dozens of them here who take time from their crazy schedules to involve themselves in difficult situations like this. So you're right, but to me the central tragedy is that it's the American government, by their actions, that's creating largely on multiple levels the necessity for this type of legal interdiction to take place. I mean, that's the fraud, isn't it? I mean, we're creating a generation of refugees, truly a human crisis, by our drug policies, which we are then using the weaponization of the American government to then turn on as a result, the predictable flow of people away from that, and using our power, if you will, to demonize and criminalize those folks. And in doing so, put them in horrific conditions physically, as well as mentally. We are both sides of this crisis here, and it's thoroughly preventable.
I wish it were. It is preventable to me and to you, yes. However, we're still working through the legacy of the support that the United States gave to the training and the supplying of paramilitary forces in various countries in Latin America in the 80s.
Right.
That's what we're still dealing with at the moment, as still compared with some of the legacies of policy decisions from 15 to 20 years ago. Keep in mind that, the problems of asylum seeking really intensified under the Obama administration, and that you did have people screaming at the time that was a humanitarian crisis in the making. So essentially, for the folks who are still going to be around, they can set their calendars to 30 years from 2011, with all of us with American administration officials still continuing to put forward the degree of chaos that they're imposing in this system. Go ahead and add 30 years to each time that this becomes a crisis. Mm-hmm. With the tragedy being that most people won't have the awareness to look back over what happened decades previously that has led to the problems that they'll be facing then.
And not only is that true of the Central American and Latin American theaters, if you will, but the same thing happens with us with respect to Middle Eastern issues. Americans have fundamentally forgotten that in a completely unrelated issue, that it was the United States that blew up at least a somewhat democratically elected government in Iran, brought in the Shah, and then set the stage for the revolution that has now challenged us. If you look at the clock, it's about 30 years. It's about, I guess, is that the gestation of a international crisis? About 30 years. You're talking similar numbers. Well,
I haven't graphed it, but we do a disturbing amount of long-term damage that we try to understand with short-term causes. And to your point too, I'm glad that you brought the Middle East into this. Another important thing, in June, there was a landmark case before the Supreme Court about the capacity of people applying for asylum to appeal the decisions that were made. For as much as we see immigration as being a problem within the Americas, that was decided on a case for somebody who had attempted to claim asylum in the United States from Sri Lanka. So, the immigration problem is much more complex than just looking at the southern border. Right. The southern border, of course, is closer to us, so it gets more attention.
What was that? The Tamil Tigers who were ripped up Sri Lanka, or depending on your perspective, were freedom fighters for Sri Lanka for all those years, if I have that right. It's happening across the world, to the greater point, and it appears that the method with which we chose to address these problems, to your point, a generation ago, have finally come full circle in the worst ways imaginable. We've only got a couple minutes left, but what is the solution? You and I often end up on very depressing notes by the end of our shows. What needs to change? I mean, we've got the prospect of a new administration. Is there any one school of thought, group of people, candidate, university, methodology that exists out there that can counteract this and possibly, amazingly enough, prevent similar mistakes going into the future?
I'm not optimistic that there is, because it's such an emotional issue. If you look at migration, if you look at asylum seeking, if you look at refugees, if you look at all of these various things coming together, these people have individual worth, and over the centuries of the United States, immigrants have consistently improved our country. If you can't make a human rights case, or if you won't buy into a human rights case, you should buy into a case of self-interest with what we have to gain from people who want to be here and have an appreciation for what it means to actually become an American. And even so, even as a nation that's falling, that's flirting rapidly with falling below the replacement rate, where we're looking at long-term ability to fund various things like Social Security, the solution to these problems is to have new people paying into them. And as Americans have become more prosperous, we've had fewer children. The solution is to encourage immigration, but we won't do that.
As long as immigrants of every stripe can be positioned as a foil to, quote unquote, the American way of life, as we attempt to make America great again. The cynical demonization of an entire group of people that represents every nation in the world, every imaginable religion, every imaginable background, is government cynicism at its worst.
That's certainly been the case.
Oh boy. All right. As you know, we often end on a smile, but I will retain my position, in the fetal position under my desk as soon as I get off the air. I promise folks, and you and I promise each other to work aggressively to find those green shoots, those rays of hope, that university perspective, maybe from the Western New Mexico University, maybe from the University of Chicago, maybe some emerging group of economists who will capture the attention of folks who are right of center in this nation and prove to them once and for all, actually as Pew done and other think tanks have done for years, but one more time with feeling that they can't be accused of fake news. Can we recruit a capitalist out there somewhere to go make this case so that they can't be dismissed so easily? I don't know. Reason Magazine, I was going to say Reason Magazine makes regular attempts at it, and they're as libertarian as they get, but libertarians aren't the problem. I'll proudly say that, not on this situation.
We could channel the ghost of Andrew Carnegie and ask him to talk about how he was able to contribute as an immigrant to the United States and move forward all the way to today. We'll keep fighting the good fight on this, but it's such an emotional issue. I'm not aware of the magic bullet to convince people that this is an absolute good in its own right, and also in our collective national self-interest.
And yet, for any free-thinking individual, it's as plain as the day. It really, there are difficult concepts to grasp. This shouldn't be one of them. It should not. It's been thoroughly proven. But as long as our politics, and unless we become Vulcans somehow, as long as our politics are rooted in emotion and most predominantly fear, then we will in fact continue to rehash and replay these mistakes.
Regrettably so.
Well, it was great to have you on again.
It's always great to be here, Pat. Thanks for having me back.
No, it's been a little chaotic with COVID and everything that's going on with BLM and some of the racial tensions that have finally exploded. Some of the stuff that we've been talking about for a year finally exploded here in the United States. That's another conversation. But let's get back on track and let's get together in a couple of weeks, because the cycle of events, the news cycle and the issues surrounding this will not slow down. They'll just continue to accelerate. And as always, I'm grateful for your contribution to our effort here. And we've got some new software. So, folks, if you're just catching the end of this, we are going to put this into replay this weekend. So you'll have ample opportunity to hear it. And we'll also be putting it up on the YouTube. Fortunately, over the last few months, we've been able to overcome and develop a backbone in terms of our systems here, so that we've been able to improve access, remote access, as well as the imaging and the quality of the show itself. So I'm grateful for both our contributors, like Professor Hernandez, and also our listeners as they stood with us as we continue to grow as an effort. Andy, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It's always a pleasure, Pat. Thank you for having me back.
God bless you and the people, the great people of the greater Deming, New Mexico metropolitan area. And again, as always, say hi to a certain minister for me, okay?
I will. You take care of yourself too, Pat. Thank you.
We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course our new home, our new site, which we continue to build every day at coalitionradionetwork.com. Our older shows and a lot of material is still available on Coalition Radio US, which will live in perpetuity on the interwebs. As always, you have an amazing choice of places to spend your time. We're grateful for both our contributors, like the professor, and we're grateful for folks like you who have chosen to spend some time with us. Follow us on social media. Spread the word. Outrage porn free is prohibited. Is in full force here, and conversations like this, incredibly enough, are part of our daily ritual. Have a wonderful night.